And welcome to the Aquarium of the Pacific. I'm really excited to kick off tonight one of our first Wednesday series. Tonight, we're talking about southern sea otters. My name is Jenny Dean. I'm the Vice President of Education and Conservation here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. Tonight is possible because of some of our generous donors, and I'd like to name all of them. So the first is the Courtyard by Marriott, Long Beach Downtown Hotel. Our second group is Stephen and Brenda Olson. And then third, we have Ralph and Hazel Osborne and the Lois Rourke Charitable Trust. We have very special speakers tonight. Some of you might recognize them. Yes, they definitely deserve a round of applause. We have two staff members here tonight to talk to you about southern sea otters. First, we have Brett Long, who's the Curator of Mammals and Birds here. And then sitting next to him, we have Megan Smylie, who's the Sea Otter Program Manager. They'll be talking about southern sea otters. If you're not already familiar, this is a very charismatic species that is found off of the West Coast here in California. They are very integral to our kelp forest ecosystem, and likely Brett and Megan will talk a little bit about how they keep that system really healthy. Let me give you a little information about Brett and Megan in case you don't know them. So Brett has over 25 years of experience with otters in many settings, here and other facilities. He currently serves as the Sea Otter Program Coordinator for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Megan has over a decade of experience working with marine mammals, and her role here at the aquarium is to manage and support the Sea Otter Surrogacy partnership with Monterey Bay Aquarium, including the management of the southern sea otters and the exhibits that they live in here. And you'll hear a lot more about that Sea Otter Surrogacy program coming up. They'll be doing a presentation with some fantastic imagery and maybe some films, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. So about 15 minutes of question and answer that will follow their presentation. And then after that, you can mingle with each other, with Megan and Brett, with other staff members of the Aquarium of the Pacific who are here tonight, outside. So you'll be exiting down here on this ground floor and have the opportunity to purchase some cocktails, do some arts and crafts, and continue the conversation. With that, I'm going to kick it off to Brett and Megan.
Thanks, Jenny. All right. Thank you, Jenny. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. I hope that you enjoy what we're going to be talking about. We are genuinely excited to be presenting to you about all of these animals, not only that we have in our collection here, but ultimately what does that collection represent, which is the wild population of southern sea otters. So like Jenny said, I'm Megan Smylie. This is Brett Long. Let's get started. Tonight we're going to be talking about 5 main subjects. The first one is just a general introduction to sea otters, so a little bit about their natural history. The second one we're going to be talking about is kind of the history of AOP and sea otters. So the past and present of our Sea Otter program, and then looking towards the future of our Sea Otter program. The fourth topic is definitely going to be one of lots of discussion, and I imagine it's going to be pretty fun. In that 5th section of question and answers, we wrote on there that is the best part. We genuinely are so excited to hear from you about some of the questions you may have. So if you don't get your questions answered during that section of the presentation, feel free to come find us afterwards.
We're going to talk a couple minutes just about sea otter natural history, a little bit beyond just the fact that they're very cute and charismatic animals. And so they're a unique marine mammal species in that they're the smallest, with males weighing somewhere between 65 and 75 pounds and females in the sort of 40 to 50. That's specific to southern sea otters. Northerns are a little bit larger than that. One of the unique things about these animals is that they have a very high metabolic rate, which roughly translates into they have to eat a lot to keep functioning and stay warm in the wild. And so 25% of their body weight, if someone like me, that means I would have to eat about 50, 55 pounds of food per day to fuel the furnace that's sort of driving my physiological processes. That can be very challenging in that although they are designed and built to live in the ocean and their extremely dense fur keeps them warm, they still need that sort of caloric energy to go through to keep them operating and staying and living in that environment. They have very acute senses, both above and below the water, and are very adept at foraging in our coastal or near coastal ecosystems. Historically, sea otters were continuous along the western coastline, all the way from Baja, California, up through Alaska and over to Russia and Japan. The fur trade through the 1800s, for the most part, almost eliminated this species. The remnant populations were in Russia and in Alaska, and then in a small, very small population off of Central California was rediscovered in the 30s of about 50 animals. Since that time, the southern sea otter population has expanded to about 3,000 animals. It's restricted right now between about Santa Barbara through just south of San Francisco. And one of the goals that we're going to be talking about tonight is certainly looking at how can we help to expand back into their historic range and sort of protect those populations again.
Before you skip that slide, the yellow population is their historic range. Is their current range. The red population is their historic range. So you can see there's some pretty significant gaps in those. And that, like Brett said, we're going to be talking a little bit about how do we decrease some of those gaps. So sea otters are a keystone species. I'm sure anybody that has visited any facility with sea otters has heard this message before, but for those of you that have not, a keystone species is a species that can significantly change the function of an ecosystem. So if you removed that species, the ecosystem changes dramatically. This picture is a pretty cool representation of what that looks like. If you removed that green rock, that arch is going to tumble, or at least fall in a way that does not look that same way. So while the ecosystem may not fully crash, it definitely will be transformed with the loss of a keystone species. So I realize that this is a little bit, it's not sea otters. You're not seeing cute fuzzy otters up here, but this right here is the reason that we even care about these cute fuzzy creatures, because they are a keystone species that help protect some of the most important ecosystems along our coastline. Actually, I would argue the most important ecosystem along our Pacific West coastline. Some of these facts are astounding. So kelp forests can absorb up to 20 times more carbon out of the atmosphere than one equivalent acre of terrestrial forest. And the reason behind that is because as kelp grows, it uses photosynthesis to grow. It grows at this incredible rate of up to 2 feet a day, and it's metabolizing carbon in that photosynthesis process. And it's very, very impressive. The middle statistic is astounding. A kelp forest without a sea otter can capture 4.4 megatons of carbon annually. If you keep that same kelp forest and you add a sea otter into it, that number goes up to 8.7 megatons annually. Now, I'm not an expert on carbon emissions, but that is a pretty impressive difference when we're just talking about adding one species into an ecosystem and changing nothing else. They also live in estuaries, which are seagrass beds, and seagrass beds can provide up to 10% of the ocean's carbon storage. Again, keystone species in action, healthy ecosystems are controlled by sea otters when it relates to kelp forest and estuaries. All right, so let's talk a little bit about sea otters at the aquarium and kind of what our history has looked like. Some of you in the room have been here since the aquarium has opened in 1998. Sea otters joined us in 1998 here at the aquarium. Pictured here are the beloved Brooke and Charlie. This is not 1998 Brooke and Charlie, but this is sometime 2000s Brooke and Charlie. They were here since they were about a year old and until all the way through the end of their life, which many of you got to see them in person. They were amazing animals. And they really represented how we managed our sea otter program prior to 2021. That meant that our populations were pretty stable. We didn't get that many new animals, and we did not get rid of that many animals. So people got to spend a lot of time emotionally investing into them because you got to see the same animals do things every single time that you came to visit. And so this created this really, really cool relationship with the public. And our daily care really focused on close training sessions that provided great animal health care for the animals and engaged our public so that we could educate them on how special this species really is. You can go to the next one.
One more thing. Brooke
Oh, yeah.
and Charlie were representative of early sea otter rehabilitation in the United States. And so a majority of the southern sea otters that are in zoos and aquariums were otters that did not make it through a rehab program and that they were acceptable to release. So this is going to contribute to the story that we're telling, that as it shifted in the early 2000s, that the success rate of releasing went higher.
So sea otters at AOP, what's been happening now, the present. I'm starting this really around November of 2021 when we started to shift the way that we managed our existing otter population. And I'm going to jump slightly ahead. In March of 2020, everybody remembers that time, something very incredible happened at the aquarium. We signed an agreement with Monterey Bay Aquarium that allowed us to create a partnership for sea otter surrogacy. And just like everything else in the world, in March of 2020, they came to a screeching halt. So that program has been a long time coming. We're going to talk plenty about that later. But in November of 2021, we began taking in some non-releasable animals that were going to be housed here on a fairly short-term basis until they found their long-term care facility. And this really represented the start of our sea otter surrogacy journey, because even though these animals were not going back out into the wild, these animals were allowing our staff and our animals to practice the things that we need to know, the skills that we need in order to make this program successful. It's promoting a ton of behavior that really prioritizes what animals will need to know when they do go back into the ocean. So our females got to practice being moms. They got to practice teaching animals how to groom and forage and socialize, all the things that an otter needs to know from its mom. And so these orphaned pups that get paired up with the adult females are learning all of that from them, and it's amazing. Our next couple of slides kind of demonstrate a few of these things so we can
And one of the other
see.
primary goals when we started bringing in the young non-releasables, in addition to sort of validating whether our adult females would make good surrogate moms, was allowing our staff the opportunity to learn new skill sets and new ways of managing these animals with the intent of release. And so how we interact with them, how the public sees them, or how the public sees us interact with them has radically changed. And we're hoping that some of tonight's talk is going to give some either validation or explanation as to why that. So it really was this great opportunity for us to practice surrogacy before we had potential releasable animals in our care.
So this first video is a video of Millie, who is one of our adult females that lives here. Many of you have seen her on Habitat. Millie's about 7 years old, and in this video she's paired up with Otter 927. That was her pseudo-surrogate otter. And we can play the video and we'll chat after. So a couple of things you're going to see. Millie's hoarding all of the crabs. She's a fantastic mom. She's tried and true, super amazing maternal instincts. So you can see that she scooped up all those crabs. Just to give you a little context on this video, right here we actually had 5 sea otters all together. There was 2 adult females and 3 juveniles of varying ages and relationships to one another. I don't mean biological relationships. I mean 2 of the pups were paired with 2 of the adults, and there was another juvenile that was not paired with an adult. And so this video is hilarious because Millie grabbed all the crabs. You'll see that in the video she offered 927 the whole crab. He dropped it, doesn't know what to do with it yet. She takes it back, breaks it into smaller pieces, and starts to hand him the smaller pieces, at which point you're going to see him start eating. To this day, this video was April of last year. I still get goosebumps watching it because it is so amazing how instinctual these responses are for these animals. Nobody taught her how to do that. She just does it in a phenomenal way. And so this is just one video of one of the cool things that our females have been getting to practice since we've taken in these pups, and it's pretty amazing to see.
The partnership with Monterey Bay Aquarium and Sea Otter Surrogacy, although we didn't formally partner with them until March of 2020, this has been a plan for many years at the aquarium to participate. We had the opportunity to bring Millie down here in 2019, and she has a neat history in that she was a stranded sea otter pup that was rehabilitated at Monterey Bay Aquarium, went through the Sea Otter Surrogacy program there, passed all the prerequisite criteria to be released, was released, and did very well out in the wild for about a year and a half. She started having some less than desirable interactions with kayakers off the coastline up in Monterey, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife decided that it was safer for both Millie and the people that she was interacting with that she was brought back in. When they brought her back in, or I should say Monterey Bay Aquarium brought them back in and did an exam to do a health status, they found out that Millie was pregnant. She got to participate in a project at UC Santa Cruz that was looking at maternal investment and cost of reproduction in sea otters, and was allowed to have that pup. They did studies on both the mom and pup, allowed her to raise it in a setting that was very similar to the surrogacy program at Monterey Bay Aquarium. And then when that pup was weaned, the pup was allowed to be released. And then Millie came down here. And so it was sort of a little cheater animal for us, and that we had some confidence that she knew how to be a mom. It was whether or not she was going to be a good surrogate. And so she had practiced some of these skills before, but very maternal animal, and certainly likes to claim pups as her own. Which is a very good thing to promote and have when we're trying to work towards that.
So this next video is just a video of what you're going to see as you continue to visit the aquarium. Back in the day, in our past, we did many of our demonstrations were training sessions where we would talk about training and the really cool benefits that it does have. What you're going to find now is that the majority of our presentations are based around talking about naturalistic behaviors for the otters, talking about some of their cool adaptations, and then ultimately the conservation messages about why we care so much about these animals. So this is Cooper and Ryder out front. They're just diving down to the bottom, foraging off of the bottom. The fish look super cool in here. It's cool video, but this is a little bit more realistic about what you're going to see and some of these cool naturalistic behaviors that we get to encourage so that they can practice that and teach other animals how to do that out in the ocean. So very important to note, these guys are not going to be released back into the ocean. These are deemed non-releasable by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but we are still having them practice these behaviors because these two boys were orphaned pups that we paired with our females, even though they are non-releasable. And so we're still allowing them to do those types of behaviors for about 50% of their time.
And it varies. One of the things that we're also trying to work on is to ensure that we have sufficient numbers of surrogate females in the future to act as surrogate moms. So these happen to be two young males that when the young females or the surrogate moms are in with them, we modify how we deliver food to them so that they are constantly practicing those behaviors or those foraging skills. When the males are weaned and the female pups aren't around because they are non-releasable and functionally irrelevant to the surrogacy program, we can work with them in a different way and then condition them to be more prepared for their future homes. The young female pups that are here, we manage a little bit more strictly and try to encourage these naturalistic behaviors in the hopes that they're going to go away for a few years, be hosted at other facilities, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then when they reach 3.5, 4 years old, they'll come back into the surrogacy program and be future surrogates. So it's a way to sort of plan a little bit farther ahead and hope that we can continue participating in these programs going forward.
So this is what you've been waiting for. I know all of you are here for adorable otter photos. That is an adult female with her otter pup. And the future of AOP's Sea Otter program is really supporting all things surrogacy related. And again, Sea Otter Surrogacy was founded up in Monterey. We are incredibly fortunate to become a partnership of this program. As you're going to learn later on in the presentation, it's very successful and it has big meaning. These positive results have big, big meaning, not only on the otter population, but ultimately on the ecosystems that they live in. And so cute baby otters are the future of our sea otter program. Again, Sea Otter Surrogacy is a partnership between the Aquarium of the Pacific and Monterey Bay Aquarium. They have really been the founders of this, and you're going to see on our next slide that the timeline is pretty cool. There's some fascinating nuances to it, and so we can just hop right over to that. So the history, this really should be called the history of sea otter rehabilitation. Surrogacy proper, many of you in the room are going to laugh when we say that word, doesn't actually start right away at the beginning of this. So in 1984, Monterey Bay Aquarium began to rescue and rehabilitate southern sea otters. They used methods that are very common with all marine mammal rehabilitation centers, and that was pretty successful. The results of that, they started to see that the otters that were re-released were successful and that they could live out in the ocean, but a lot of those animals were not reproducing, therefore they were not adding to the population. And they couldn't quite identify why. They were also becoming some nuisance animals, and so some of them were a little bit more habituated to people, and in 2001 they had a genius idea of pairing up these orphaned pups with adult females so that the adult female could completely rear the pup on its own, and once it was ready to be weaned, that pup would go back into the ocean. And we're going to talk some stats in a moment, but that program started in 2001, so that was the start of sea otter surrogacy as we know it today. Sea otter rehabilitation in a more traditional way, so if an adult strands and is injured or sick, that still happens. That's usually not at Monterey Bay Aquarium. There's another facility that they work with in close proximity to that, to Monterey Bay Aquarium. And so Monterey Bay really specializes in the surrogacy program, and they're capable of doing the other one, but they do try to allocate all of their resources to surrogacy because it has been shown to be significantly more effective. In 2020, that was when we signed our official contract and permit with Monterey Bay Aquarium. So that was our official entrance into the surrogacy program. And then just to give you kind of an update on where we are at right now, our surrogacy pools are almost finished. Our females have gotten lots of practice being moms, and our staff is just continuing to learn and get better and refine these skills needed to make this program a success.
And so one of the primary reasons that this partnership exists is that although Monterey Bay Aquarium has certainly spent the last 20 years refining this process, any given facility is going to have a capacity of how many animals can come through that system. So in general, on any given year, or on average, I should say, there are probably 12 to 15 southern sea otter pups that strand in the current range. And Monterey Bay Monterey Bay Aquarium has capacity for up to 4 pups per year to go through the surrogacy program. And so the facility that we've built behind the scenes or designed in our building, just about to finish up, is really going to double that capacity. And so our goal is to be able to accommodate up to 4 releasable pups per year so that we can start to put more animals back out and lead towards some of the topics that we're going to talk about next.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk some stats and how successful Monterey Bay Aquarium has been with their sea otter rehabilitation. The top statistic is starting from 1984 till present day, they've released 261 sea otters successfully out into the ocean. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, 261 animals represents about 8.7% of the population that exists for this species. There's 3,000 approximately out there, and 261 is a pretty big number. Over 70 orphan sea otter pups have been reared through the surrogacy program. Again, we're talking approximately 4 a year, starting in 2001. 4 a year is a maximum, so for those of you that are doing the math out there, it's not exactly 4 a year, but that is about a maximum for them. And then lastly, this is what we talked about earlier, 43 pups have been born to surrogate-reared sea otters. 70 otters have been released to the wild. 43 have been born to surrogacy animals. That's a pretty great success rate. And again, it goes back to 261 were released prior to, well, in the entire rehab time. But in 1984 to 2001, that's when we were not seeing a lot of that reproduction happening from those rehabilitated animals. Since surrogacy started, 43 pups have been born to those animals, which is pretty astounding. What you got to
There's
add?
a very, part of Monterey Bay Aquarium's program is a very robust field side to it that directly tracks these animals when they're released via tag technology and visual observations. And so these numbers, I think they're amazing. But at those 70 animals, they weren't all females. And so it's 43 pups clearly born from the females that were out there. And so this is not calculating what the males have contributed to population growth. That's a little harder to track out there, but tracking female sea otters and live pup births is a little bit more feasible to record. Jenny mentioned earlier that one of the additional roles that AOP participates in is that we help coordinate sort of the sea otter programs through the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. In the United States proper, meaning not including Hawaii and Alaska, we've got about 14 facilities that house sea otters. And one of the things that we're really focusing on is trying to bring this network of facilities together, because every facility out there has a role they can play in this. They can help foster, well, probably not the wrong word in the scope of this conversation. They can house younger sea otters, younger female sea otters prior to being available for surrogacy. And equally important, at a certain point, female sea otters reach an age where it's better for them to not participate. I certainly can't speak to that personally, of what that interject effort is to raising children. But at about 10, 11, 12 years old, we feel it's best to sort of retire those females from that program. And typically you're seeing female sea otters or southern sea otters living to 20, 21 years old. And so Megan mentioned earlier that when our program shifted from sort of maintaining otters as part of our education programming and public display, now our otters, as they age, will work with these other networked facilities to house them for the last decade of their lives so that we can continue to maintain capacity at this facility to have 4 sea otter pups going through this. And so it's been a lot of fun. It takes a little more time than maybe we anticipated, but and it really appreciate AOP's willingness to let us sort of participate in that network level. But as we bring on more facilities or start working with those partners, they are just very committed to helping in whatever capacity they can, recognizing that we're likely the surrogacy facilities are gonna be on the West Coast adjacent to where they're gonna be released. And if you're a facility that is outside of that area, then there are these other ways that you can help.
So we'll talk a little bit more about AOP and kind of, again, redirecting back to surrogacy. The first thing that you're going to see when you go towards our surrogacy area at the Aquarium of the Pacific is this really cool surrogacy kiosk. And this is ultimately the direct access the public will have to the surrogacy program. It's where it starts and where it stops. Legally, per our permits from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, we are not allowed to display animals that are being rehabilitated to go back into the ocean. That could lead to habituating them to humans, which ultimately means that they would fail out of this program and not be successful out in the ocean. And so the guests will not be able to view our rehab animals, and that's okay. We have some really cool footage. There's cameras above the pools that will be able to gain footage. With all of these non-releasable pups, we've been able to give direct access to public viewing. Many of them were on habitat last summer in our Summer of Babies at the sea otter habitat, and it was Summer of Babies. We had so many sea otters up there. It was really, really dynamic and so cool to watch. So this kiosk is really cool because it's going to teach about the messaging. It's going to teach about this really important initiative. And we just want to say thank you to everybody, the donors, the staff that have done all of this. Thank you to everyone who's poured their heart and soul into this project. It is a significant amount of work, and this is a really, really cool initiative that could change a lot of things.
You know, our development team at AOP, and I guess really technically working in a nonprofit, we're all part of that team. But the development team, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of shutdowns and closing, was able to raise well over $1 million to go towards this program. So it's just amazing how many people have stepped up to really point sort of calories and dollars to making this happen. So thank you.
This is a really cool image, and Brett, I'm going to let you take over for part of it, but I want to introduce it. So the image on your right is what was drawn up, the initial vision of the pools for surrogacy, and then obviously the camera view is what was just a few days ago. So this program and the idea of it started many, many years before 2020, but once we got close to that line, it was go time. And the benefit of the partnership is that both facilities get to teach each other and learn from each other. And these pools are designed in a really cool way. Our footprint is a little smaller than Monterey Bay Aquarium's, and the design of these pools were intentional to this program. You're going to see that there's the circular pool. Do you want to tell them about it? You made it. You should do it.
We all made it. We had a relatively small footprint to work on, and again, ultimately, the goal is to increase capacity of animals that can be released, and so we just needed to maximize that space as much as possible. So these pools were designed to initially hold one surrogate mom and one pup per pool. There'll be times throughout the time that those animals are here that we might mix in other juveniles to sort of vary their environments. But one of the things that we tried to incorporate was a way that we could handle the animals less. And so the typical way that you're feeding animals or providing food is in a foraging context, whole, shelled, or natural state foods going in the environment that the females teach the pups how to forage. And then at every 2 to 4 days, depending on how many animals and how much you're putting in, you have to move the animals so you can get it in clean and take out all the food that's not eaten. And so the idea here is that the animals can shift into the smaller section while we clean the other ones. We also attempted to make them, from a management perspective, this is a little shocking for me, and it's sort of hard to tell in the picture, but, you know, keeping marine mammals in our care, there's lots of oversight for that, federal, state, and all those types of things. These pools were built almost to the square inch, the legal minimum that you can keep 2 sea otters in a non-rehab setting. And in the rehab world, you have some variances to those rules because the intent is they're there for a very short amount of time and they go away. And so over the course of the next couple of weeks, we're going to be using our utilizing, better word, our non-releasable otters to sort of point out everything we did wrong, because they're very good at doing that. And we would prefer that they figure it out before we start trying to do it with animals that we don't have as much ability to interface with them. But it's been an exciting project, and certainly working with Monterey Bay Aquarium to learn with what worked well for them, what they would do differently if they had the opportunity to rebuild, and we tried to incorporate that in. And then hopefully in the course of the next maybe 4 to 5 weeks, they might be sending staff down to sort of help us start working through these things. So it's been really cool. They are custom designed, custom made, specific for sea otter surrogacy, but also expands our capacity to just hold additional otters in the event that we needed to move them off the exhibit or move them into other areas. Is there anything else on those? Megan did mention they've got some interesting perimeter fences on them. Again, while releasable otters are in these enclosures, the goal is to minimize their opportunity to be influenced by humans. And so we have lots of visual barriers been put in place, and when we're working around those animals, we'll minimize sort of talking and certainly ensure that if we're ever providing food to the animals, it's never done in a way that they perceive that it's coming from humans or hear humans around them. So a little different. It's a lot more remote. You probably don't develop the same types of connections that you might with the animals that stay in your care for many, many years, but that is very purposeful in the intent behind it so that they remain in a releasable status.
All right, this is the fun part. Sea otter reintroduction. This is kind of our final section before we get to Q&A. This is a really big deal and ultimately what represents why we're doing surrogacy. And it's going to be exciting to talk about. So this cool QR code thing that we just figured out how to build today, we're very proud of it.
That was Helen. Thank you, Helen. Yes.
Feel free to use it.
For those of you that know Helen.
In July of 2022, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published a document that they were required by Congress, correct?
It was a legislative action, yes. I'm not sure which body,
Legislative
but yes.
Required to complete. And they utilized some other resources along with their own. One of those would be the Alaka Alliance in Oregon. It's a nonprofit that is attempting to align with everyone to reintroduce otters into Oregon. And so a lot of the information that you're going to find in that study when you use that cool QR code is based off of the Alaka feasibility study for Oregon specifically. When U.S. Fish and Wildlife got involved, they expanded it into Northern California and to Washington, which would ultimately merge the northern otters with the southern otters. And that has some benefits that we can talk about later. The finding of this feasibility study is that it is actually feasible from a biological, socioeconomic, legal viewpoint to release southern sea otters back into their historical range. Reintroduce sea otters back into
Can
their
I say one
historical
thing?
range.
And so
Please.
Megan's absolutely correct. The study said it's feasible and can be done. By no means has the official decision been made
Nope.
to reintroduce otters outside of their existing range. But the study at least supports that it could and probably should be an effort that would be worthwhile pursuing.
The two big objectives, you guys can read it up there. It's really about restoring the species as an individual. This includes going into its historical range and removing it from the federally listed threatened species list. And then the reason that they're even interested in this is the second objective and the most important one, which is restoring the habitats and ecosystems that sea otters actually come from. So there were 4 main parts of this study. You guys don't have to read the whole thing. It's 200 pages long, but there is a really great executive summary that's 2 or 3 pages. I think you should read it. It's pretty fascinating. They examined the biological feasibility of this, and that was a big thumbs up. We have an incredible amount of knowledge about the species alone and experiences from past translocations of these animals and reintroductions into existing ranges that we have this down pretty good. It's set. The biological feasibility is there. That was almost the easiest hurdle to get over. The next one is the socioeconomic feasibility. The study concludes that it is possible because the overall net gain to the economy will be benefiting from the reintroduction of the sea otters. Kind of the con to that is where the money is going specifically in the socioeconomic side of things is not going to be the same place that it is going currently. So really it's going to be, if we're going to make forward progress on that, it's going to be bringing in people that are currently benefiting from no sea otters and people that would benefit, which is everyone, for having sea otters. And so this one is the biggest hurdle.
And the study does very clearly acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
That although the net gain is positive for a lot of reasons, that those that will lose potentially their livelihood or the fisheries that exist in the absence of sea otters will have to be redirected towards other ways of earning money, but that there should be opportunities for that, and that the money's generated through ecotourism and other functions will outweigh that. But it's something that's going to have to be considered, and they certainly are not easy conversations.
No. The next one is the legal feasibility. Right now, there's no laws in place that actually prohibit the reintroduction of this. The one that gets a little bit odd, it's more of a risk associated with it, it's not necessarily a prevention, is the Marine Mammal Protection Act has some language in it that could make this a little bit challenging if we expand into some of those fishing areas, and we can chat more about that later. But ultimately, the cost feasibility, they have not identified where the sources of these funds are going to come from. Likely, it would be an increase in taxes, which We live in California. This is a hot topic, but when you see that cost, that's a total of $26 million to $43 million over 13 years. That is not per year for 13 years. So that's not a lot of money. There's 40 million people in the state of California. Over 13 years, that's 10 cents-ish a person for 10 years or 13 years. I think my math's a little
It's not
off
as
there,
shocking
but
of a number that I was expecting to see when I read this study.
it's not that much money.
But it does cost.
To have some pretty incredible benefits.
So it's what's next. So the feasibility study's been published. Almost immediately, a working group was put together of a lot of the stakeholders, not all of the stakeholders, that are going to start working through sort of the logistics of what reintroduction might look like, where the source population animals are coming from, whether translocation, which is fundamentally moving wild otters from one place to another, or whether surrogacy, as an example, becomes the source population for that. That working group, I think, met first in October and November over a course of 2 days in a virtual format. We were fortunate enough to be invited to participate as a member or as an aquarium, which has been a neat process to look at. We're certainly going to be more focused on the logistics and hopefully not as focused on the socioeconomic and the legal things. We're going to leave that for other people that are more fine-tuned into that. But that working group will meet again virtually in February and then in person in March. And then we're going to see where it goes. It's an exciting time to be a part of the potential of sea otter reintroduction along our coastline.
I have one more page of slides or sources. Can
All
you
right,
skip it? And
very
then we'll go
nicely
to the-
documented, Megan, yes.
Oh, thank you. I had some help. Thank you.
All right, that was a fantastic talk, well-deserved round of applause. And we now get to open it up to your audience questions. So if you have a question for Brett or Megan or both of them, please raise your hand. We do have some people with mics walking up and down the stairs, and they will get to you as they can.
Yeah, thank you very much. You sort of answered my question to a degree that they're going to be released back into existing habitats, correct? So they'd be moved back up north. But looking to the future, where down here would you be looking at reintroducing them if all the things fall into
Yeah,
line?
you can have at it.
Yeah, realistically, you're absolutely correct. The current permits that are in place allow releasable otters to be released within their existing range, which again is basically north of Santa Barbara to south of San Francisco. Reintroduction, when it expands, it is almost certainly going to go north long before it's going to come south. If the otters choose to come south on their own, that is fantastic, and it is possible. There's a long history with that. In regards specifically to southern sea otter reintroduction and translocations. And when previous translocation projects were done in the 80s and 90s, they actually had sea otter exclusion zones in Southern California that for the projects to go forward, if the animals entered those zones, the federal biologists had to go in and recapture the otters and put them back either out at San Nicolas Island or back up in the range north of Santa Barbara. And I think when you get into it's not... One could argue it's in the socioeconomic part of it, but the fisheries that either existed or exist in this region probably have some very strong lobbying efforts with the politics, and it's going to be much more reasonable to try north than south initially. And so I think that the working group that's developed right now is focusing specifically on California. The group that Megan mentioned out of Oregon is looking at Oregon, and I think that most people involved realize that it's much more likely that the permits, or if it moves forward into reintroduction, that there are sites in locations in Central and Northern California and Oregon that are probably much more likely, and then if and when, or when and if that is successful, then I think that Southern California might open up to that. But I would predict that we're going to plan on Southern California repopulating by a growing otter population as opposed to maybe directed efforts. That's an opinion,
Good question.
not a...
Hi, Megan and Brett. First, I want to thank you for your amazing presentation and your effort of rehabilitation of the otters for the last few decades. I have a question about the numbers. You said 3,000. Is that the total number of the hosts, just all sea otters, or is it just southern sea otters? Because I am the volunteer at the education department here. One thing I noticed is like when we talk about sea otters, a lot of people is not aware of how endangered this species is. Because I feel like they're quite common in zoos, at least in the United States. So people was like really shocked when they heard, oh, only 3,000 there. They normally perceive that they might be as common as the seals or sea lions, but they're actually as rare as the giant panda. I wonder if, the second question would be, will there be any effort on kind of like advocating, increase the awareness of how endangered this species is from the surrogacy program?
So I can take the first part and add in what I'm missing here. So the 3,000 number is specifically for the southern sea otters. So the three species altogether, the southern sea otter is the threatened species. The northerns are in a relatively better place.
Most northerns, yes.
And so when you're saying sea otters, there's subspecies. When we're saying the threatened species, we're mostly referencing the southern sea otter. And then ultimately, to answer your question about how are we going to change our messaging here at the aquarium, part of redeveloping some of our presentations, and certainly once we have our surrogacy pools up and running, we're hoping that we can have people standing out there, essentially shouting from the mountaintops that this work is incredibly important, not because we care about saving one or two sea otters, but because what those represent to the ecosystems. Again, it's important that we improve their species numbers, but it's important because we need them to help our ecosystems. And so I think that we've been working with Jenny to kind of help shape some new messaging and speak a little bit more to those exact messages. Because you're right, we didn't talk about that for a long time, or not in a directed way.
You know, southern sea otters, and I'm not going to get my dates right, so I'm not even going to try, but when they were listed under the Endangered Species Act, they were listed as threatened, not endangered. So there's two categories under that act, with endangered being the one that's in more concern and threatened of concern. And to get off that list, the population has to meet criteria, which is about population size and density and many other factors. And there's some talk that 3,000 is nearing that number. I think what biologists have some concerns is that although you go, hey, there were 50 of them theoretically in the 30s and there are 3,000 now, that's a pretty cool growth curve, but it has almost flatlined the last several years, and then it's not going past that. And whether there's geographic boundaries that these animals aren't going past, again, Point Conception, San Francisco Bay, white shark populations are up, so there are maybe threats now that didn't exist before. Certainly, at least on a big level, we're not hunting them in the same capacity that it was. And so that listing status actually can be challenging. It would actually probably be easier to do reintroduction if they weren't listed in the Endangered Species Act, because the legal requirements and the permitting would be easier. But they just haven't met all of that criteria listed in their recovery program. So again, it's a great story, and I think it's a success story to talk about, but the goal would be, again, sort of changing the dialogue. And we talked about this as we were talking about what we wanted to do. You know, I mean, certainly when I started in this field and was interested in sea otters, it was about sea otters. Like, hey, for all the reasons that we all are. I mean, how can you not like looking at, like, and they're cool. And boy, then I got into the sort of physiology. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And it wasn't until maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 years ago that the story started to change. It wasn't about saving sea otters anymore. It was about the impact that sea otters have on our coastal ecosystems. And so I try to not highlight the numbers of sea otters as much as the impact that they have on our kelp forests, on our eelgrass beds. And even the workshop or the sea otter biologists aren't standing up and going, hey, we're saving sea otters anymore. That's what they said for 25 years, because that's what we were focused on, saving sea otters. Now it's really about utilizing this keystone species to focus on restoring our ecosystems. So I think I'd like to see and we're working on it, so our communication's leaning more towards that and not focusing so much on the numbers of sea otters, but really the impact that they have on the environment around them.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I had a question that sort of followed up also on the northern and southern sea otter populations, and I was curious if there are, well, first of all, where the northern population sort of begins, if it's like at British Columbia North or somewhere else, and then if the two species do breed together, and so just wanted to live that with you. And also wanted to just comment that I was very impressed with the small number. The cost, I do think, is incredibly low for this. We have parking garages that cost more than that. We have all sorts of just basic construction that, you know, $25 to $43 million is quite modest for what this would accomplish.
I agree. I mean, I don't know when it changed that I thought $43 million was cheap. Something certainly has changed in my life. But I completely agree that it is almost to me inconsequential, that cost relative to what this would accomplish. To answer your question on northerns and southerns, and so at this point, northerns extend into Washington State and then go up through southeast Alaska, and then there's some patchiness through central or parts of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska, and then back towards central, you start seeing them out the Aleutians. Anything west of Cook Inlet in Alaska, which basically the Aleutian Islands, that distinct population segment of northerns technically are listed also. There's been dramatic decreases. 90% of the population has decreased in the Aleutian Islands. And some of that might be animals moving somewhere else. Some of it could be top-down predation, not hunting from humans, but from other marine mammals. And so that's sort of where those two major populations exist now. It hasn't been decided whether northerns could be the source animals to come down south or whether southerns can be utilized via a surrogacy program to start going north. But certainly the intent is to merge those two. And then it gets to people a lot smarter than me to talk about genetics and what is what. But these animals are subspecies of each other. They absolutely can interbreed, or there is no distinction in that regard. And ultimately it would be the goal would be to have a continuous population of sea otters along the Pacific coastline and not necessarily focusing again on southerns and northerns. Someone don't hand the microphone to Aaron.
What question about being protected? So if the sea otter comes off the endangered species list, is that detrimental to them? Or do they have any protections without it?
Well, all marine mammals have protections under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So even if it comes off of the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, it's still going to fall under that umbrella, which is good. In some ways, it might improve the speed of this reintroduction process because some of the restrictions placed, especially as it relates to fisheries, could be a little more challenging because it's on that federally listed threatened species. Once that status is removed, some of the incidental take laws change and you are allowed a little more room for error. As it is currently written, because they are a threatened species, there is no incidental take allowed whatsoever, which means an immediate shutdown for those fisheries. And so,
if a take were to happen.
If a take were to happen. And so, in some ways, it's nice because there's a little bit of extra protection, but if we're talking about a large-scale reintroduction, we need to account for some level of loss.
And there is some funding. I mean, when you get into sometimes it's easier to find money when animals are listed in the Endangered Species Act, and so when they become delisted, which actually is a positive, right? That's what we want. Then maybe it's a little harder to find federal money or find state money, but I think I look at this price tag and go, that money could be easy to find. So I think that when I talk to sort of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife biologists or USPS biologists that sort of weigh in on listing status and that type of thing, you see them talking both ways. There's benefits to both, and really in the end, you want that act to do the right thing. And so if these animals meet the criteria to come off the listing, then we want them off the listing. And still, again, stop talking about sea otters and start talking about their impact on the ecosystem, because that would then be irrelevant to their listing status. And so it could be helpful to have them off that so that you have a little bit more latitude getting them out there. Okay, Erin, you're up.
Oh, no. All right. No.
No.
There, now. So you, in your initial slide, you caught my curiosity up the West Coast with the historic range that you've talked about. Was it the fisheries that depleted the otters in all of those ranges? Okay, then what were the primary causes?
The fur trade.
Fur trade, yeah.
100%. That's not what's limiting it now, but the decline of sea otters in the 1700s and 1800s was 100% because of European settlers that found value in the most dense fur on any mammal that exists.
I mean,
So-
it is really soft.
And there's no doubt in that. Like that's not a. Yeah. Yeah. No. Fine.
Easier to reintroduce them then into their old historical range, if that's the case, right?
From a biological standpoint, there's no restrictions. So currently, they could be reintroduced from a biologically feasible standpoint. They could be re-released anywhere along that range and be successful from that aspect. It's not from hunting that's going to affect their
And there certainly are
population.
still many threats to sea otters.
Yes.
I mean, one of the major ones being oil transportation along the coastlines. And oil's the reason that one of the primary reasons that southern sea otters are on the endangered species list is one major oil spill could wipe out the entire population. And so the threats exist, they're just different threats. So what drove them near extinction is very well understood and defined. There are still different threats that affect the population growing and reestablishing itself. But
Good question.
Unfortunately, I have to cut our questions off, or pause them, actually, is how I should describe it, because you do have the opportunity to continue to interrogate Megan and Brett in our cocktail reception that is upcoming. So let me give you a few details about that, but first, let's give Brett and Megan another round of applause for their time. If you're feeling like you missed out and there were no live otters on stage today, don't worry. We have live otters here, and we really invite you to come back to the aquarium any day between 9 and 6 to come visit our otters that are here on exhibit. And as Megan said, it's a dynamic show, right? We're changing out what otters you're able to see there. Hopefully in the coming months, definitely within the next year, we'll have surrogate pairs, and we'll be able to interpret about that at that surrogacy station. So please come back and see our otters that are here. Now, for the cocktail reception, you're all going to descend orderly down the stairs and exit the way that you came in. There is a bar for purchase of beverages. There's also the opportunity to adopt an animal, perhaps as a Valentine's Day gift, because that's coming up. And then finally, there is an art and craft table that exists so that you could decorate your own cards that you could take to a loved one. I want to thank everybody again for coming here today. If you were here live and in person, that's wonderful. If you were online, we're also really excited for that participation. And for anyone who couldn't be here today, all of our first Wednesday lectures are recorded and put it up on our website. So you have the opportunity to go watch this again or share it with your friends and family. So please do click on those links. Thank you. Oh.
Oh, yes.
I forgot the next month. So we do host this monthly, the first Wednesday, right? So coming up in March, we're going to be talking about octopus. Our speaker is Dr. Dana Staff, who has a new book, The Lady and the Octopus. So in addition to her talk, there'll be the opportunity to purchase and have your book signed by the author.
All right. Thank you.
Now you're actually dismissed. Thank you all for coming.